Evening, everybody. I'm Robin Carroll Mann. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator for the Summit Free Public Library, and I'm glad you could join us all for tonight's program, which is a discussion with author Libby Copeland and her book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are. The book is owned by the library, though it's checked out at the moment, and of course it can be purchased from all of the usual suspects. The way things are going to go tonight is I'm going to be throwing some questions at Libby and about the book, and then towards the end, about 7:45, I'll open things up to general questions. If you can send them to me via chat, that will probably be the easiest way to get them asked without people tripping over one another, as so often happens on Zoom. Okay, to begin with, I'd like to acknowledge the Friends of the Library who are providing the funds for tonight's program, and to thank our speaker for joining us. Libby Copeland is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture and science. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and Smithsonian Magazine. Her book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, published by Abrams in 2020, explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. I'm going to ask everyone who hasn't already done so to please mute yourselves so that we can all better hear Libby and her answers to the questions. And as I say, towards the end of the program, we will open things up to questions from the audience. Okay, then. Libby, thank you so much for joining us. How did you come to write The Lost Family?
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's really cool to be here. So I've been a journalist for about 20 years. One of the things I've always been interested in is, sort of how we formulate our identities and how we kind of come to our personal narratives, how we come to just make decisions, even if those reasons aren't clear to us, behind how we kind of shape ourselves, right? How we define ourselves to the world and what the world tells us that we are. And the forces that kind of influence that, the forces of culture, the forces of family, the forces of, the era that we're living in, how all those things sort of shape identity. And, I had been writing a lot about technology, and I was particularly interested a few years ago in DNA testing because, this was a technology that had the capacity to not just reveal who you are, but to change how people think about themselves, by revealing things they didn't know, or by suggesting sort of different categories of identity than they had imagined for themselves. And sort of how this came about is about 4 years ago. I write a lot about science. I was talking to one of my editors at the Washington Post, and we started talking about home DNA testing and this idea that this was this product that could have kind of profound revelations contained within it, right? And at the time, there were only about 8 million DNA test kits that had been sold all over the world. But we were hearing these stories trickling up of people, for instance, somebody who didn't know that they were adopted, and they took a test at the age of 60 and they found out, right? And then it's like the then what? I was so interested in the then what? Like, what happens when this product, which is sort of marketed as entertainment, as recreation, offers a kind of a profound reckoning that you maybe didn't even go looking for. So I wrote an article for the Washington Post about this idea that DNA tests could, really introduce these substantial revisions to our identities and these questions that it raised about family, about self, about ethnicity, about race, about Americanness, and even about truth and honesty and what the generations owe each other in terms of how they talk to each other about, you know, who they are and where they came from, right? All this kind of really amazing stuff that can come out of it. And so this comes out, it's the summer of 2017, and I get this like incredible flood of emails from people who read the story and who resonated with it and then like wanted to share their story. And they were like, I took a DNA test and I want to tell you what happened to me. It was unbelievable. And the stories were really moving. They were intimate. They were stories about people finding out things about, you know, about their families or about themselves, things that they never questioned, things that they thought they knew that turned out to be substantially different than they imagined. And then the kind of the invitation to re-understand their own lives began. And I started talking to them over the course of months and years. And I thought, this is a really profound journey that we're on as Americans, right? Like, we think we're just spitting into a vial to find out if we're 12% Irish, but in fact, we're really asking much bigger questions when we spit into these vials. And it was in the course of those conversations with people who had emailed me that I started to think that this needed to be a book. And then that ultimately became The Lost Family.
The story of Alice Collins' Plebic frames your book. Without spoiling the story, could you explain why her quest provides such a powerful window into home DNA testing?
Yeah, so, you know, I needed a sort of a central narrative. Like, you know, this is a big topic and it's complicated, right? It's a lot of overlapping themes. When you're talking about DNA testing, you're talking about genealogy, you're talking about the cultural rise of it and looking back at the past, you're talking about hard science, you're talking about, you know, genetics and how do they actually do these tests and how does it work in the lab? And there's philosophy and there's bioethics, there's questions of privacy. It's like sort of like very complicated and overlapping, all these fascinating fields coming together. But at its heart, you know, I think journalists and authors have a duty to write a story that is very compelling. Because I think if you are trying to introduce ideas or invite people to think about things or have an exchange of ideas, you know, your greatest duty is to get people to read all the way to the end of the book. And the best way to do that is to construct a narrative that's, you know, that's very compelling. And I came from, you know, somebody who reads a lot of thrillers. I read a lot of detective stories. So I had this idea that I wanted to write a story that was absolutely true. It's, you know, it's nonfiction, but I wanted something that was so compelling that it would read like an Agatha Christie. Only the question wouldn't be like, who murdered this guy, right? And found in the library. The question would be like, who am I? Which over and over was the question that I found people were asking as I interviewed them. People who had found something surprising when they took a DNA test were often asking these kind of questions that posed a kind of existential mystery, right? Who am I? Now that I know the truth, now that I realize that, you know, the man who raised me wasn't my genetic father and some other man, some stranger was, who am I? Right? This is a really big deal. So I went looking for a story that I felt like could kind of contain all this, right? And like be the means to push you through the narrative. And I found the story of Alice, and it's a completely wild story. And I won't kind of tell everything about it here because it's like, I don't want to reveal the story, but it's like, it's really amazing. And basically, Alice is a woman who takes the DNA test back in 2012, so almost 10 years ago now. The databases were really small at the time. And she's a genealogist, and she's interested in trying to figure out a little bit more about her Irish roots, which are very strong on both sides. She's Irish, American. And she gets back her results from the company that she tested with, which was Ancestry, which, by the way, at the time had just unveiled their home DNA test. And the company's results suggest that she's half Ashkenazi Jewish, which is Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. And, you know, the companies at the time were kind of trying to provide you information about where you came from 500 to 1,000 years ago, but it wasn't clear to Alice just how accurate this was. And knowing she's Irish, she just figured that Ancestry like didn't know what they were doing. And that, you know, she's clearly not Ashkenazi Jewish. She's Irish on both sides. So she goes and takes the test with another company. And so she takes the test with 23andMe. Those are the two big ones, right? Ancestry and 23andMe. Most people have heard of them. And the 23andMe results are the same. And that's when she realizes, okay, wait, this is a mystery. I'm half Ashkenazi Jewish. You know, how did this come to be? How did I get my story so wrong? And she decides to set out in this very methodical fashion, like a detective, to investigate with, you know, sort of going with the most, you know, likely explanation. And the most likely explanation is that she's not related to dad. You know, perhaps her mother had a relationship outside the marriage. Perhaps she was donor conceived. And when she investigates that, she's able to disprove that theory. And every other theory that she comes up with, which would be the likely theories for most people if they get a surprise result, she's able to disprove. So she's not adopted. She doesn't come from a community of people who hid their Jewish ancestry in an attempt to assimilate or attempt to, you know, escape discrimination. And her theories get more and more far-fetched as she goes along. And ultimately the explanation is like a really surprising one that goes back 100 years. And it's pretty unusual. But what's great about her story, even though it's obviously not the typical one, is it sort of contains other ones because, you know, along the way, as you're exploring her story, I get to look into this phenomenon of what are called NPEs, which stands for non-paternity events or not parent expected. Some people call them misattributed parentage experiences. It's one of the most common kinds of surprises within the world of home DNA testing. People take a test, they find that the man that they thought of as dad is not genetically related to them and that somebody else is. And so Alice's story, you know, it's almost like a kind of a catalyst to tell other stories. Many of these stories are ones that I heard from people who reached out to me by email, or I found them through my reporting. And so I do get to tell the story of people, you know, I get to tell the story of a woman who didn't know she was adopted until she was 51 and she found out through a DNA test. I tell the story of donor families, you know, with many, many siblings who are kind of connecting with each other, the donor siblings, and with their donor father, right? And how they navigate those relationships, and sometimes in cases where they didn't know that they were donor conceived. And I tell the story of a man who whose genetic ancestry was hidden from him, and he did make that discovery through DNA. And his genetic ancestry was hidden from him to protect him from discrimination. His mother told him he was Sicilian. In fact, he was Black. And she was trying to protect him from the racism that she had experienced growing up as a biracial child. So Alice's theories, you know, could have been true, and they are true for many other people. She just happened to be a very sort of surprising situation, and it took her 2.5 years to solve her mystery. So we sort of follow Alice through those 2.5 years when she's kind of a very methodical, intelligent, resourceful woman, and she works her case basically every day for 2.5 years until she solves it.
You said that one of the realities of the technological advances is that their true impact is hard to anticipate. Is that the case with home DNA testing?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, you find this with other technologies too. You find this with Facebook. You know, I think to some extent with Twitter, there's this idea that it kind of starts out as one thing, and then it has all these sort of surprising ways in which it plays out. And I mean, DNA testing is a really good example of that because, you know, it is in the very beginning sort of framed as something that will help you with your family history research. And, you know, the industry started 21 years ago. And it was started by a genealogist down in Houston, Texas. It was started by a guy named Bennett Greenspan, who founded a company called Family Tree DNA. And it was really the most niche of niche products. You know, it was expensive to do DNA testing back then. The results were different because they were looking at a different, they weren't doing the kind of DNA testing that we're familiar with today. It was a different type, and it was much less informative and more crude. And much harder to kind of connect with people and build your trees. It wasn't this kind of, quite so much of this kind of group effort where you're kind of connecting the world and you're finding unknown cousins. It was just a much more narrow slice of America that was drawn to this product. And, you know, you see it start to change because the first, you know, 10 years of this product, existing, I interviewed Bennett Greenspan down in Texas, and he told me, he would go to genealogy conferences and try to like persuade people to buy this. He would be like, here's why it's useful to you. And it was hard. It was a hard sell. These kits were hundreds of dollars, and it just wasn't that clear that it was ever going to be like a mainstream product. And he never imagined in the beginning that it would be. And then what you see is that something shifts. Something comes on the scene called autosomal DNA testing. And autosomal DNA testing is looking at the DNA that you inherit from your mom and your dad, not just what had existed earlier, which he was offering Y-DNA testing, which is, looking at the DNA that a man inherits along his Y chromosome from his father, or mitochondrial DNA testing, which looks at the mitochondrial DNA that we all inherit from our mothers. And those kind of give a very limited picture along the single branch, and they point us towards sort of more ancient roots and ancient migration paths. Autosomal DNA is kind of this huge breakthrough, because what it does is it allows you to see two key pieces of information. You're getting your cousins, your DNA cousins, maybe you've never heard of them, along your maternal and your paternal sides. So like other people who've tested with the same company, and they show up as matching you in the database because you and they shared overlapping genetic segments, and the company can see that. And the other thing is that it's giving you a picture of your genetic ancestry going back 500 to 1,000 years. And that's a complete game changer. And all of a sudden, this is a product that is like widely marketable. It's widely usable by people who don't necessarily have a technology background or a science background or even a serious family history interest. So what happens is within the last 5 years or so, companies like Ancestry start to market the heck out of this product, and they make it into basically, this is a gift, this is entertainment, this is the Christmas present you get for someone because you can't think of what else to get them because they already have everything, right? And that is such a change. And I mentioned earlier that when I started writing my book, or when I first wrote that article for the Washington Post, that was 2017, there were 8 million DNA test kits sold. Today, there are about 40 million DNA test kits sold, and most of those are to Americans. And that is a rapid change. And a lot of those people are, they're not necessarily family historians, and they don't always know what they're getting. And sometimes they're getting a really profound surprise, or they're finding out something that's a kind of opening a door to them in terms of their understanding of their family history that maybe it would have been closed otherwise because they just weren't into genealogy, but DNA makes it easy. And then poses all these questions about identity that are so fascinating to me. So yeah, I mean, I think of this as, and then, I mean, I'm sorry to go on, but like the applications of this are kind of amazing, right? Like we're seeing it now in crime fighting, right? Which could not have been anticipated, with cold cases going back 50, 60, 70 years being solved through the use of the DNA that's been gathered for family history research and ancestry research purposes now being used for these, crimes to be solved. And, all this kind of ways in which this is potentially reshaping how we may look at our own genes in terms of healthcare, and how, medical research may be kind of turbocharged by it. So it's a really fascinating industry. When I interviewed Bennett Greenspan way back a few years ago, he told me that when he first started the company, and he was doing proof of concept in the late 90s, so they were kind of testing out the product before they put it online. He said that he tested it with I think it was 24 men, because it was Y-DNA testing, so only men could take the test. And he said within that little window of people, those 24 men, he found one surprise, some significant surprise. He didn't want to tell me what it was. But, I say that because on the one hand, the companies, I will say, in some ways didn't anticipate it. In other ways, it was always true from the very beginning that there were going to be things that people were going to discover that they weren't expecting. And at this point, the companies often get phone calls from people saying, why does this say I have a half sister? I know what, why is a half sister showing up as a cousin or a DNA relative to me in your database? I know I don't have a half sister. You must have switched my vial with someone else. Or why is it saying I'm half Italian? I know I'm definitely not Italian. My dad was English, right? And it's almost never the company that's messed up or switched a vial. It's almost always we who have our stories wrong. And so on the one hand, the companies didn't anticipate it, and yet on the other hand, I think the breadcrumbs were always there for us to kind of foresee that this was going to happen.
What are the implications for those who have not been tested? What can you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, the big takeaway of the period of time that we're in is that in many ways you are not invisible even if you've never taken a DNA test. So the majority of the US population at this point is potentially impacted by the revelations that are contained in these databases, and potentially identifiable to somebody who's related to them and looking for them. And that's because, you know, even if you've never taken a test, you have third, second cousins and closer in the databases who already have, and they share DNA with you. And in a sense, their decision to take a DNA test is in some ways a decision for you too. So how does that play out? It means that you may discover something about your family, something about your roots, something about even your health history that you didn't know because of a DNA test that you didn't take because somebody else took it. It means that there's no such thing as an anonymous sperm donor anymore. And it doesn't matter if you donated sperm in 1975 and you never took a DNA test, you are not anonymous. If you have a child who was created out of that sperm in 1975, and that child is looking to identify you and figure out who their genetic father is, they can take a DNA test and they can figure out your identity through cousins, through paternal cousins, even though you're not there, right? It means that in the kind of laws that exist that bar people who are adopted from knowing who their birth parents are, which many see as discriminatory, those are, while still an issue, they're not a barrier from people knowing who their birth parents are. It means that donor siblings can find each other. It means that sometimes there are donor siblings discovering that they are one of 100 or 200 from the same donor father. And so we're learning about how the industry has conducted itself, right? It also means that parents can't assume anymore that their children don't know the truth about their own genetic origins. And that may be the case even if the parents don't take a test. If their children do or someone else does, sometimes that kind of news can leak out, right? There are reasons why testing or not testing may be important to you or may have implications for your privacy, or potential implications in the future for privacy issues and other issues. But in another sense, none of us are invisible. And that means that we've kind of entered this moment of great intergenerational reckoning where family secrets are dead. And in a very short time, there won't be such a thing as somebody who doesn't know the truth about their genetic origins.
Now, these non-paternity events where people discover that their father is not who they thought, how are people reacting to that, both the person who did the test and other family members who didn't?
Yeah, I mean, this is like one of the most interesting things to me, and it's one of the things I kind of wanted to document, and I wanted to kind of tell some of these stories of some of these families from 360 perspectives to kind of understand why sometimes these stories work out and sometimes they don't. Sometimes you wind up with a gorgeous reconciliation and sometimes you wind up with a rift, and the why is really interesting to me. And I was really interested in how these stories play out because I think in some cases, this is a profound mental health issue, and there's not a lot of support for folks who are going through this. Imagine you take a test because you're just curious, casually curious, right? And like Alice, your ethnicity estimate is entirely unexpected on one side. But unlike Alice, you are able to determine that the reason for that, when you look at all your paternal relatives, they're all different, and you have two first cousins you've never heard of, and you start asking questions, and it unravels that you're not genetically related to the man you consider dad. That is a profound experience of discovery. And I say that not as somebody who's discovered it myself, but as somebody who's just interviewed a lot of people. It might sound like, if you haven't had it happen, it might sound like, well, what is the big deal about that? You're still you. You still look the way you look in the mirror. But it's actually very disorienting and dislocating. And I've talked to enough people that you start to hear the same phrases over and over, and you start to think about what a kind of existential crisis this can pose. People will talk about looking in the mirror and not being able to recognize themselves because they suddenly don't know where their face came from. They'll talk about being kind of in a state of shock or trauma or numbness where things don't make sense. They'll talk about a sense almost of like a dizziness where they had a feeling of roots and rootedness and identity and place and belonging, and that is gone. And they don't know where they belong. And they feel as if half of their identity or roots is missing. And that often starts a search to know more about that half of yourself that, that you didn't know. And this is, something that's happening to has happened already to hundreds of thousands of people. Just this one experience, and there are many other kinds of surprises, but the experience of discovering that you're not genetically related to your dad, based on the interviews I've done with population geneticists, the data I've looked at, and search angels, and looking at the raw number of people who've taken a test, it's easily, conservatively, hundreds of thousands of people who've gone through this experience, if not more. Very often there's a desire to learn more and then potentially to reach out. And that is not always reciprocated. Sometimes it is. And I tell the story of a man named Jason in my book who is welcomed into this blended family by his genetic father when he finally finds him. In other cases, it's more like what happens to a woman named Linda, who discovers she's adopted through a DNA test. And she gets rejection on both sides. And she gets rejection in part because her identity is a threat to the family itself, right? The fact of her existence implies either a relationship before the guy was married or a relationship outside the marriage, right? And a lack of maybe transparency or honesty on his part to his spouse. And then, sometimes the children feel, these may be adult children in their 40s and 50s, there's a disruption in the birth order. There's a sense that this person coming in is somehow a threat. What do they want? Do they want to be written into the will? There's often an assumption that person coming in has, some sort of nefarious purposes. And there's a sense of violation. And it's a weird thing because it's a person who is genetically related to you and yet feels like a stranger, and people react by throwing up walls. And so you see a lot of that, and there's a lot of broken hearts, frankly. People who honestly just want to kind of be accepted and learn more about themselves and where they came from on their father's side, meeting with rejection. And you see a lot of letters being written, and sometimes, it's an attorney writing back. So this is an amazing kind of experience that we're going through, and it's playing out in living rooms and on phone calls like across America right now.
Now that's the psychological effect, on the individual level. What about the sociological impact of DNA testing?
Yeah, so right, this sort of psychological impact. You have the and I'll just say on that note, there's often a kind of a collision of interests, right, between like say my right to know who I am, or my right to know my genetic roots, and your right to privacy if you're my mother, right? Am I entitled to know everything about how I came into the world? Depends, you may have conceived me in a way that was deeply painful. So you hear stories about adult children confronting their parents and their mother saying it wasn't consensual. You know, I didn't disclose it because it wasn't consensual. So these are really deeply painful circumstances sometimes, or, you know, 1,000 other kind of scenarios that make it difficult for, you know, or in the case of the child who's coming into their father's life, right, to want to know them and the father to not want to be known. So there's that kind of collision of interests. And that's kind of the psychological, that's one of the psychological kind of points of friction. And then the sociological kind of revelation that comes with it is how much we've changed over the last 60 years. So that things that, you know, ways in which children came into the world that were highly stigmatized are now things that we don't, we really don't worry about as much. We don't shun people for, like being a single mother, at least quite to the extent that we did, right? There's not the level of ostracization. You know, relationships outside of marriage are still obviously pretty taboo within the context of relationship, but you know, having a child through donor conception is something that now most people understand is something to be disclosed to the child and talked through with them early and often, right? Psychologists say that's the best way. And adoptions are much more often open, in addition to, of course, being disclosed. But back in the day, they weren't necessarily. And so what you see when a person takes a test and they're 65 years old and they're finding out something about the way they came into the world that was never revealed to them, is you're kind of like taking a rocket ship back to the past, and there's a completely different cultural context, right? It's so different. It's practically a foreign country. And so what you're seeing is kind of two kind of vastly different cultures colliding. And very often when kids go to their parents and they say, and I say kids loosely, but these are adult children going to their parents and saying, like, why didn't you tell me? It's difficult for the parents to articulate how vastly different that world was and why they never revealed the secret. Why after all this time they never told their children. And, you know, the only thing I can say is that family secrets have a lot of inertia. And it becomes harder to break them over time, not easier. It's almost sometimes like they're suspended in amber. And I think some of that may be the emotional content of those decisions still carry a great deal of weight. So if you made a decision you know, and there was a feeling of shame or embarrassment or guilt or anger or fear that was prevailing when you made the decision to keep that secret, you know, maybe it was for the protection of your family and your child from ostracization that you decided not to reveal to the child or anyone how that child came into the world, those feelings prevail, even though we're now in a vastly different cultural context.
What about the implications of home DNA testing for the African-American community, given the history of slavery in America?
Yeah, I mean, DNA testing is really fascinating. Like there's all these kind of ways it plays out, right? And it's very complicated in its grays because some communities really are able to benefit in a way that paper trail genealogy can't always benefit them as much because the records aren't there, right? And if you look at, I mean, there's that saying like history is written by the winners, right? That is really true, right? Like you have to have been considered important enough to be recorded in order for, you know, a contemporary now to go be able to look back and trace their past. Even better if your people were literate and could write things down, right? Even better if they had a surname that they carried down through the ages. But what if they didn't have any of those things? And that's what a lot of African Americans, contemporary family historians face. They are tracing a great-great-grandmother, and, you know, they've got her in 1920 and they've got her in 1910 and they see where she's living, right? And let's say she was formerly enslaved, and they're trying to trace her back through the 1800s. They will slam into this brick wall, what genealogists like to call a brick wall, if they try to go back before the 1870 census, because when she was enslaved, she was not considered worthy of a name. She was a tick mark in a box, and all of a sudden she disappears from the record. So how do you follow this ancestor? And that's where DNA testing can come in handy for some people. It's not that DNA testing exists on its own, but DNA testing combined with genealogical research can really yield a lot of benefits. And I tell some of these stories in The Lost Family. You know, I talk about an African-American genealogist who's able to trace his people back to before the transatlantic slave trade, and actually connect with living African cousins, and through DNA testing combined with genealogy. And what's completely amazing about this is that the gift of knowing these cousins means that they can tell him not just the geographical area that they came from, which can often be quite broad, depending on the company. When African Americans get their ethnicity estimates, they're often not quite as granular as what European Americans are getting. But the gift of talking to this cousin is that this cousin can say, not just that we came from a specific area, but we came from a specific people, a community of people, and this was their name, the Fulani. And this guy, T.L. Dixon, who told me the story, I mean, he's able to then look up his people, right, and research this branch of his family. It's like pretty amazing. There's another woman, there's another family, I should say, I interviewed for the book. They had an oral history that was passed down, that one of their ancestors who had been enslaved, one of their foremothers who had been enslaved, had had a child through her white owner. Or enslaver. And that was a story that they had told orally that they had not been able to, verify, and they were able to verify it through a combination of DNA and genealogy, and then introduce themselves to a white cousin who descended from that white enslaver and his wife. And that woman didn't know, of course, as many white Americans don't know, that their ancestors were kind of implicated in slavery. A lot of African Americans can't help but know. And a lot of white Americans, part of our privilege is to be able to not know. And part of what I'm interested in this moment is this idea of kind of reckoning, right? This notion of cross conversation, where because of this moment that we're in, and because we're looking at our past and the kind of, with a maybe more clear-eyed look at American history, and the past and all its complications and sometimes in its cruelties, that perhaps this is kind of a moment for reconciliation with the past and for our honest, transparent discussions about what really happened. In this particular family, that family story has been replicated across, I've heard many other stories like that, where white cousins and black cousins are kind of working together or getting to know each other because of this shared history and kind of coming together over that right now.
What are the implications of home DNA testing for how we think about family? Is it expanding the nuclear family?
I think this is one of the most interesting questions, right? Because it really depends, sort of on the individual, right? These questions of kind of how you define your ethnicity or how you define your family in the wake of a revelation that it's different than you thought are extremely individual. And every person gets to make their own decision about what that means for them. And in Alice's family, the discovery turns out to have implications for all of her siblings. She comes from a large Irish Catholic family. There's 7 of them. And they all decide what it means for them, and they all think a little differently about it, right? Some of them see the discovery and its ultimate explanation as extremely meaningful personally, and some of them don't. And that is true when it comes to this question of family for everyone, that it varies. However, I will say that in many cases, it seems to be expanding and allowing for a great deal of emotional nuance about what, for instance, a father is, right? Because it's not the case that when somebody discovers that that beloved dad is not genetically related to them, that they suddenly go, well, I have no use for you, bud. Let me go find this new guy, right? That's still dad. It is just that they also then want to know more about this other guy, and maybe they'll call him John, right? Or maybe they don't even know what to call him, because often our language doesn't even allow for these kinds of relationships. But that doesn't mean that we don't necessarily have room in our kind of psyches and our hearts for these relationships. It just means that the language hasn't caught up with where we are. So what you see is that people in a kind of emotionally sophisticated way, they say yes to both. And that I saw that over and over. Not always, because a lot of times people do, I'm not comfortable with this, because of the way it came to me, because of the secret that was kept, because of the circumstances of this discovery, or how this child came into the world. It has implications for how I see my mother, my father, my family. It's very threatening. That happens for sure. But there are many, many cases where it seems to be expanding and kind of introducing the idea that even when you don't have the language for these relationships can have like great meaning and emotional content and great validity anyway.
Have you yourself taken a home DNA test, and did you have any surprising results?
So yeah, I mean, I've taken a number of them. There are 4 major companies. I've tested with 3. And you might say, like, why would test, DNA is your DNA. Why would you bother to test it more than one place when it's just going to be the same? But it's not the same for a variety of reasons. It's not the same because the people who test in that database are going to be different than, the databases don't talk to each other. So, if you're looking for a specific first cousin and that person tested with one company, you're going to find them at that company and not necessarily the others, right? So you may be curious to do some research, and you may want to see who your DNA cousins are at more than one company. And also the ethnicity estimates are vary from company to company. The DNA results that pertain to your genetic cousins, your relatives, are very solid science, but the ethnicity estimates are an evolving science that's imperfect because we are all so similar to one another on a genetic level that it's really quite difficult for them to parse out these distinctions. And we've moved around through time, right? We didn't stay in one place. It's not as if our forebears stayed in this one spot in France and never moved and never married across the border into Germany or whatever. Germany didn't exist. So there's all these questions that kind of swirl around when you come to genetic ancestry that make it difficult for a company to kind of pinpoint that. And you will find that the results evolve over time, and they vary from company to company. And so when I was getting into it, I was testing, I was trying to, see how my results varied. It's very interesting. What we found was that we found kind of amazing family unknown branches on both sides. We found people that we would not have known to look for because we didn't know they existed. And so we wouldn't have consulted the paper trail because we didn't know to look. And DNA revealed them. On my mother's side, we found a whole branch of the family through a second cousin of hers who we didn't know existed, a whole branch of the family that survived in Europe as Jews through everything the 20th century through as Jews living in Ukraine. And this was an entire side of the family that we thought had not survived. And we talked to her second cousin on the phone, and he was in Brooklyn, and we were in Westchester, New York, and my mind was blown. It was like, what? It was amazing. And on my father's side, we found his second cousin in Sweden. His grandmother had emigrated a long time ago, in the 1890s, very long time ago. And we were so kind of inspired by this sharing of information, and her daughter was a genealogist, and we're learning all the stuff about the family, and we didn't know they existed because there was a break in the line, kind of a ne'er-do-well guy who wasn't supposed to be having children with certain women, and he was anyway. And so again, we didn't know to look for these different branches of the family. We were so inspired that we went to Sweden to meet these cousins and trace the life of my dad's grandmother, who was a profound influence on his life. And the thing that struck me that in meeting these people and learning about this great grandmother's life, and I never knew her, she didn't live when I lived, but she shaped my life in many ways, is, just that the past is actually not that far away, right? Like we think of the 1890s, which was when my dad's grandmother came over from southern Sweden, as this very long time ago, before cars and before TV and radio and airplanes and all these inventions that we live with now. And so those people must have been really, really profoundly different from us, almost, unrecognizable. We couldn't even really relate to them. And yet a second cousin relationship doesn't seem that distant. And so the fact that we were able to sit and have coffee and a pastry with my dad's second cousin brought home to me that the past in some ways isn't over. It's sort of sitting inside of you, right? And we happen to be living in this wild era when you can kind of crack it open through home DNA testing with all its complications and grays and cautionary tales. There's also this kind of wonderfulness about the discoveries that can be made. And so to me, for our family, there was a lot of kind of gifts of knowledge that came with it.
So with all these pluses and minuses, what advice do you have for people who are thinking of taking a home DNA test?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a lot of privacy issues, concerns around things like, genetic discrimination, concerns around things like the use of this by law enforcement, which are whole topics in and of themselves, and I explore them at length in the book. And some of those issues are sort of abstract in the sense that they could happen, but they haven't happened yet, and some of them have already happened. And so there's always these questions around, like, how will this information be used? And that is a complicated topic we can talk about a little bit, maybe, if people have questions, but something something kind of educate yourself around, for sure. And to know that the companies differ in their policies and how they protect your information, that's important to know. As far as this question of, how much do you really want to know about yourself and your past, which is a really big question. When you take a test through a company like Ancestry 23andMe, they will give you this little advisory, and they'll say, listen, sometimes when people take a test, they discover something they didn't expect, or some relatives that they weren't, they didn't know about. And like, we're just giving you this little warning. And when I would interview people who had seen that advisory and who had tested anyway and who had found something surprising, I would ask them, did they pay attention? And they didn't pay attention to it. And I didn't pay attention to it, because we assume we know what there is to know. Right? Of course. It would be so weird if we walked into situations going, I wonder if I'm about to open up a Pandora's box that's going to reveal something profoundly different than I imagine, right? That would be absurd. You couldn't live your life imagining that the world was that way. We kind of have to imagine that we're on a stable surface. And I mean, I think at this point, enough of us are implicated without ever having tested that in some ways the choice doesn't belong to us anymore. So the advice that I tend to give is more so for that older generation of folks who may be in possession of knowledge about their children's genetic origins that their children don't know. And that is to consider talking to them about it, because your child may find out. They may take a test in 10 years. Somebody else may take a test, and the information comes to them that things aren't as they thought about their family. And it is incredibly painful to be in that situation and have your parents be no longer alive and you can't ask them questions.
I'm going to open things up to questions from the audience. Please send them via chat. I already have a first question, which is, do you have any sense of about how many people, as a percentage naturally, are glad they underwent the analysis? Yeah,
I mean, I would say that of the people I've interviewed who discovered something really, really surprising, almost every single one of them told me they were glad to know when it was something about their own genetic origins, which really surprised me. So I'm talking about people who, were in their 60s, 70s, 80s before they discovered that they had a brother that they never knew, or that they were donor conceived, or that there was a huge family secret. That even when it was really painful, even when it meant that, I remember in one instance talking to a woman whose mother revealed that she had been coerced, she'd been raped, and she was the product of this rape, of the woman who was making the discovery. Over time, she came to tell me that she was glad, because not glad about the circumstances of how she came in, not glad about the pain to her, but glad to know the truth, because it is the truth, right? It explains things. It gives context. It answers questions that maybe were always not even quite clear to ourselves. It kind of puts into perspective certain childhood memories that we've hung on to that never quite made sense. It maybe elucidates a history of dysfunction and abuse in a family. It makes people understand themselves better when they know how they came into the world. That's what people told me. Is that true for everyone? Not necessarily, right? And not always true for the older generation, and not always true for the people who kept a secret and didn't want it revealed, and not always true for those fathers who are being contacted. But for the people who are discovering things about their own genetic origins, almost every single one of them told me they were glad to know.
Next question. With Ancestry.com or 23andMe, how do they know the source of one's origin that is attributed to ancestors in a certain region of the earth and a specific country? Said another way, my tests show Irish and German. So how did these companies identify the Adams and Eves, who are my great-great-great-grandparents from generations, centuries ago, 1800s, 1700s, that lived in these countries that I am descended from? Just curious, how do they know?
Great question. So they're looking at your ancestry 500 to 1,000 years back. Depending on the company, they're pinpointing it in a slightly different place. They are using reference populations. Those are people who they come from huge data sets. Some of them may have been public data sets or, groups of people that were being studied. Sometimes those are people that they've gathered or their own customers, right? And they have determined, they have vetted these people, and they have determined that all these people have deep roots for grandparents in one place for a long time. So hundreds of years, right? They've been able to document that they go far back in this area, in this particular region.
So like a control group in an experiment.
And it's not 5 people or 10 people, it's 50 or 100 or 1,000 people. And their reference populations grow. So that's part of why 5 years ago, your results wouldn't have been as good. And now they might be better, but they're not perfect. They're still not perfect, right? Because of all the vagaries of change and time and history that we were talking about. And by the way, Germany didn't exist as an entity at the time that we are looking, right? I mean, I'm German French too, right? But it's almost a crazy definitional issue because they're trying to translate to modern ideas, the concept of, we have the concept of Germany, but using a period in time when there was no German state. And so, it's awfully hard, right? There's a lot of German-French overlap, at least in the 23andMe data set, that makes it hard for them to tease out whether I'm German or French in this particular percentage of my pie chart, which is like a Mutt's pie chart because I'm everything, or a lot of things. So I mean, that's the idea. And then what they're doing is they're crunching the data with algorithms and they're looking for patterns. And it's not as if when you look at your genome, it's not as if there's like a spot along your genome and it has a little flag and it says this spot is Korean or this spot is Swedish. It's not like that. We're 99.5% genetically identical to every other human being on the planet. So, these are much of the time, these multiple spots are associated with like that, right? That kind of language of couching, because it's hard to say. We look similar to one another under the hood. And often as well, Europeans in particular, who are large, European Americans are a large, group of people who want to take these tests. Someone from modern day, what we think of as Germany now looks pretty similar to someone from France or England. And these are subtle gradations that are hard to tease out for the companies.
Okay. Does anyone else have a question? I don't see anything else in chat. Let me ask, where do you see the industry going from here?
Yeah. So, it's an interesting question because, you have seen throughout its history that there are two kind of different directions, right? There's the kind of pure family history research side of things. And then 23andMe has always had as its focus that this is really a health research vehicle and that they can get together a lot of people who take their test because they're DNA test because they're curious, but really it's going to help 23andMe do research on cancers, right? If those people consent to have their DNA used for research, which most 23andMe consumers do. And the two big behemoths in this space, Ancestry and 23andMe, are really going in different directions on this. If there was a while where it looked like everyone was getting into the health market, because that's where things may be the most lucrative, at least that's what 23andMe thinks. And Ancestry kind of dipped its toe and then backed away. And as far as I know, they're not doing it right now. And they're kind of doubling down on family history research. 23andMe sees the future of this as kind of changing healthcare. You know, the Ancestry thing, which is how it's been marketed, which is why most people come to it. It's how we think about it. It's how the ads kind of like picked, you know, find out if you know, really were Italian. And then you see Kelly Ripa like ordering biscotti and broken Italian. And she's like so excited because she discovered she's Italian. That's like one of the ads. That actually 23andMe feels like is just kind of like incidental to the real kind of money making and transformational space in this industry, which is going to be healthcare. So those are the two different paths that you see the companies taking. I mean, Ancestry is going to have to expand in order to keep selling kits. So you may see more and more expansion abroad. And I want to mention, by the way, if people are interested in finding the book, that there's a, it's available at your local library. There's an entity called bookshop.org, and I just try to plug it as much as I can, because during the pandemic, booksellers have suffered, independent stores have closed their doors. And if you're interested in buying a book, you can, of mine or of anyone's, you can always go to Amazon, but you can also go to bookshop.org. And I'm putting that in the chat because it supports independent booksellers, and a lot of people don't know that it exists. So I'm putting that in the chat, my little plug for Bookshop.
Okay, thank you very much. And I see a question. When you look around the globe, where are the 40 million from mostly? Mostly
the US, yeah. And not entirely, but primarily, you know, more than 50% are American, and a lot of other English-speaking countries like the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And, you know, Americans are drawn to it for a variety of reasons. And one of them is, you know, the way that America was made and shaped, and where we've all come from, and the extent to which we've assimilated our ways out of our, you know, ethnic origins, you know, means that there's kind of a craze right now. There's a real desire, there's a real sense of yearning for identity as told through the past, right? How does the past shape who we are now in the present? And that's like really it's really telling about where we are as Americans right now, that there is such a looking backward to understand who we are right now, and deeply connected with our interest in genealogy and DNA testing.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you for all of the people who attended. And again, thanks to the Friends of the Library for sponsoring tonight's program.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Good night. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.